Hello, bruvs. We're back with Anyone's Son, a true story by Roberta Roche with Harry De La Roche Jr., who committed 4 murders on his family. What was it, 1976? So that's 48 years ago. And yeah, 48 years ago in about 2 hours. So this is the night it happened. It was Thanksgiving, as today is Thanksgiving. No way. I think the Thanksgiving was on the 27th of that year. So I think he actually killed them technically the night after Thanksgiving. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyways, it was on this day, I believe. Let me check at the beginning of the book again. I don't know why I'm fiddling around with this bullshit when, November 28th, 1976 was the date. So it's been 48 years. 39. While Harry was adjusting to life as a number, there were many after the verdict views and a mixture of varying reactions. Primarily, the comments people expressed came from family and friends, acquaintances and strangers, courtroom observers, law enforcement officers, and professionals who were involved with the case. There were also reflections from the jury. Speaking for the maternal side of the family, John Greer confided that the whole situation had been an enormous emotional drain. It's going to take us a while to get our lives together again, stated John, but we wouldn't abandon any human being in a crisis such as Harry has experienced. As soon as this happened, we gave a great deal of thought to what was right for us to do regarding Harry, said Arden. We asked ourselves what Harry's parents would have wanted us to do, and after weighing everything, we came to the conclusion that Mary Jane would have wanted us to do what we are doing. I hope she knows we are helping her son. Our feelings have always been very basic, added John. We've said from the beginning that if Harry did something, he should be punished. On the other hand, if he were innocent, he needed our help during this ordeal too. We've chosen to stick with him all along, and will continue to do so. On the paternal side of the family, Ernest Abneder spoke for his wife in a telephone conversation. When I asked Honey if she wanted to talk to you, she just lay on the couch and shook her head. No, 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 he said. She just don't want to talk about it all the time, he explained. And whenever somebody wants to bring it up again, she cries. Why don't they leave me alone? It's something that hurts her very much. And every time this thing comes up, she gets upset all over again. It seems there's no end to it. You can't understand how it is with my wife, Ernie continued. She just can't get over it. Harry Sr. was the only one we had. Now everyone is wiped out except the guy who did it. We used to have him here a lot, and now look at what has happened. I'm just bitter about the whole thing. Honey's sister-in-law, Ethel De La Roche, wife of John Sr. and mother of John Jr., agreed there was a bitterness in the family about the tragedy. But we feel nothing can be gained by talking about it, she stressed. In fact, some of us are upset and concerned that some members of our family consented to lengthy interviews with other people that might be used out of context. The whole thing was just terrible, and as soon as the incident happened, my son put up a poster in his home that said, God bless them all in heaven. Harry's godfather, Steve Madriperla, summed up the verdict by saying, there is no one culprit in this case. As I have said so many times, Harry Sr. thought the way you loved the most was to discipline your children. He pointed out in many ways he should be admired for his hopes and aspirations for his family. Probably Ronnie and Eric might have made out all right with his kind of discipline. For some reason, Harry Jr. was different. He marched to a different drummer. Harry's best friends from his area still supported him. He's not a criminal, he is. And he'll never be a criminal to me, said Rutgers student Bob Gant. More than one thing led up to whatever happened that night, reiterated Vinnie Trojan. When I heard about Ronnie and the drugs, I accepted that version. The whole thing pieces together. Other supporters who'd wanted to believe that Ronnie had held the gun were on the fence when they heard the verdict and learned Harry was in prison. Now they said the jury was still out, as far as they were concerned. I continue to find the Ronnie version feasible, stressed one of the on-the-fence persons. To me, it's a more logical story that the brother was on drugs and his parents found out and wanted to turn him in to the police, added Tink Thompson. I've heard similar stories from classmates who had the same experience and ended up running away. I can understand this a whole lot more than a boy coming home from college and killing to avoid going back. That's a stupid reason to kill, and I don't think Harry could do it. Personally, I think Harry was a victim of his own family life, a neighbor pointed out. He's also his own worst enemy, and he doesn't know how to change this, but the family wouldn't have wanted to acknowledge any instability. This would have been an unwelcome smudge on their family picture. They were really good people who always meant well, he went on to say, but I sometimes wonder, looking back, whether they unknowingly were a self-destructive family. Did they contribute to their own demise by failing to be responsible enough to what was best for Harry? And in trying to do what they felt was right, were they going by their plans for Harry instead of Harry's plans for himself? In fact, I even wonder whether Harry, in desperation, reached the point where he'd rather kill than hurt or disappoint his parents. Many people who've spent a great deal of time weighing the Ronnie version continue to ask where Ronnie was that final Saturday night, but no interviews or investigations have yielded a clear-cut, credible answer. And if anyone knows his real whereabouts, that person isn't talking as this book goes to press. Harry said that in all probability, Ronnie went to one of his hangouts, the bowling alley, or the railroad tracks after collecting his paper money when Harry dropped him off. Andy Cannon, Ronnie's best friend from school, felt sure he spent the evening with friends and ended up at a pizza place, but he didn't think Ronnie had money. I wanted him to go out, he explained, but he said he had no money and hadn't collected from his paper route. A college student from another town said she had heard that Ronnie was partying with the drug pal that night. While a pair who worked at the 7-Eleven a few doors from the De La Roche home said Ronnie was in before 9 p.m. to buy candy and exchange some singles for some larger bills. He returned to 7-Eleven around 11 p.m., according to a neighbor, who said she saw him there, but nobody knows what he did after that. And it's the general belief that Ronnie probably returned to his house sometime after 11. In an interview after the verdict, Dr. Lawrence J. Denson, the county medical examiner, stated that toxicological examinations in his office indicated there were no drugs in Ronnie's body. When asked what drugs would show and what drugs wouldn't show in such an examination, he said at any time, any drugs that a kid would use today would show. If Ronnie had had drugs, this page is not going to turn for whatever reason. It just doesn't want to go. Can't do it. There it is. In his system that night, they would have shown. People who attended the trial offered a variety of opinions after the verdict was in. Ida Libby Dengrove, a courtroom and news artist for NBC TV News Center 4, who covered, among others, such trials as Son of Sam, Joseph Callinger, Dr. Mario Jaskelevich, Clifford Irving, John Chesimard, Mitchell Stans, Reuben Hurricane Carter, and John Lennon, saw Harry as a very sick boy as she sat and sketched him. As an artist, mother, and wife of a psychiatrist, he impressed me as being very sick, she said after the trial. Could he be believed, and was his father the personality who taught him not to feel pain or remorse? It was incredible to watch and sketch him while he read his dead mother's letters and recounted the gory death of his younger brother without the slightest show of emotion. Whoever was responsible for creating what I felt was a zombie perhaps received the full penalty for the efforts. His sickness should have been spotted years ago. Help should have been given then. A retired man expressed concern over the definition of premeditated murder. I'm bothered that this boy who really needs help was convicted on premeditation because of the way he described in court walking up and down the hall while he was holding the gun. They call it premeditation, this man pointed out, but no one ever mentions that maybe that young boy walked up and down fighting with himself, that if he did what they said he did, the weaker side won out. I kept looking at him all through the trial and thinking he looks like my son. I hope that somehow, in this crazy world, people who resort to harassment learn where this can lead. Under Sheriff John Stass, who was responsible for Harry in Bergen County Jail, is convinced there's more to the De La Roche story than anybody knows. It's locked inside of Harry, he said. He has problems and he's sick. He was also very decent and nice, but something went awry. At the end of the trial, Richard Salkin stated in a TV interview that the whole situation was a tragic plight, and the conviction for 4 first-degree murders was a victory he couldn't be happy about. In other interviews with the media, he stated, in a case like this, any responsible person or attorney can't jump up and down for joy. You have to feel as a human being. You have to feel something for Harry De La Roche. I hope he can get in touch with himself. Maybe with a little treatment he will. The confession was devastating, he added. You have a man, and the man is saying what he did and why. John Taylor obviously agreed. The confession was highly destructive. Moreover, his case was a difficult one from the very start. In summing it up, we had to keep one foot in two buckets, he said, aware that he was criticized for what some people considered a last-minute switch in his plea. Taylor contended that the subtleties of his defense were lost on the people who like to say, if only it had been the insanity defense for 4 counts from the beginning, or if only the Ronnie version had been left out of the courtroom completely. The original defense was not guilty, and we also pleaded insanity, he declared. But if I had stood up before the court and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity early in the trial, the state wouldn't have had to prove anything. And in effect, I would have been saying he did it. No matter how defective the evidence is, we're saying he did it. Therefore, if the jury says we do not believe he was insane, I would have no appeal at all. But if I say, prove your case, which is what not guilty means, then if there is an error in the introduction of evidence and the verdict goes against us, we have an appeal. If in the strategy Judge Madden went in our direction, the defense would have rested at the end of the state's case. But when the confession was admitted, the state's case was made, then it became the duty of the defense to meet the confession. But how do you meet the confession? We argued that it wasn't voluntary, but we couldn't say in our minds, nobody is going to believe it. Harry's second statement was too detailed. We had to believe the jury would believe it. Since that's where we stood, then we had to consider whether the jury would accept a defense of insanity on the whole thing. That's when we spoke with Dr. Galena and discussed the insanity defense. As a psychiatrist, Dr. Galena felt that Harry was a psychotic, and in a psychotic episode on November 28th. It's hard to understand a psychotic defense because psychotics walk among us every day of our lives. You don't have to come right off the wall in order to be psychotic, but the psychiatrist for the state said you do. Did the jurors really understand what Dr. Galena said, or did they believe Dr. Zigarelli, who was more flamboyant? Dr. Galena discussed the case after the trial was over and pointed out that in the court, the issue had to be that Harry was accused of pulling the trigger and had to stand trial for that. But delving deeper, the real issue is not just Harry's role, he maintained. It's the family pathology that's back of everything. If by any chance 2 brothers were murderers that night, the focus on the family pathology is even more intense. But the fact that anyone pulled the trigger has to say something about that family. I believe that all 5 members had a very limited ability to communicate with each other and express and share their emotions and feelings. Harry is the perfect example of a psychological breakdown, of a person who says, I can't take anymore. But still, he was tied to his family with bonds that kept him from running away. Dr. Thomas Balavia, the Bergen County Jail physician, who examined Harry after the crime and who saw him periodically during his incarceration, said there had been questions about the the night and what the motives were. And in an interview with John Banaszewski of the Record, Dr. Alan Tuckman, an area psychiatrist who has had vast experience in criminal court cases, declared that the De La Roche case illustrates that people must be able to release pressures. I think the lesson to be learned from this case, he stated, is that you cannot repress or oppress people in a family and not expect them to react with rage. Pastor Roy Nelson felt from the start that the period after the verdict would be a critical time for Harry. There's no way we can give up on him, he said. Like everyone else, it has always concerned me that he hasn't shown more emotion, but I know the emotion is there. I've had insights and glimpses of it before he quickly changed the subject. Actually, I don't think anyone can really comprehend the tragedy of something so terrible happening. So for self-preservation, you block out that terrible happening. One day, I even said to Harry, I think you're trying desperately to preserve your sanity and not dwell on these things. He answered, that's right, I am. I'm convinced Harry believes Ronnie did it. In in-depth interviews after the guilty verdict, the jurors spoke of many things. Most of them spoke freely, though a few preferred not to talk because their feelings were too personal or because they felt excessive stress from the experience of being on the jury. It's an experience we're putting into our past, said Vincent Squazzo. In the jury room, only one ballot was taken on each of the 4 counts. Each was unanimous. 1 or 2 of the jurors felt ready to render a decision in less than the 6 hours it took, but the others wanted to discuss all the points and not run too fast on a verdict. For me, the turning point in the trial was when the confession was read, said Richard Kalowski, the 24-year-old tape librarian and computer operator. Once that was read, it was hard to pull yourself in any other direction. But I wondered how the officers got that out of Harry. What other circumstances were involved? I think that most of the jurors knew that there was more behind this case that we weren't hearing about. I know the why isn't supposed to be an important part in a trial, but I think a lot of us felt in the dark about what had gone on before, who Harry was as a person, and all that sort of thing. We would have liked to know the why and made some sort of decision from that. Harry wasn't a vicious person. He wasn't out to kill the world. This chapter's killing me, but we only got 3 more pages. It was hard for me sitting there all along, thinking Harry could have been my son, said Mary Flexon, the mother of 5. My own son, Harry's age, also hated the first college he attended and wanted to change the first year. He did change at the end of the year, and he loves where he's going now. As parents, you sit and listen. You just don't state, go back. But once Judge Madden redefined first-degree murder and legal insanity, the jurors didn't see how they could render anything except a first-degree verdict. I think anybody who goes as far as Harry did was unstable to some degree, revealed Michael Ronca, the 24-year-old manager. I also think he needs help, but as the judge described the law, I didn't feel at the time, and I don't feel now, that he fit all the criteria to be legally insane. Moreover, when it was determined that it falls upon the defense to prove insanity, the jury did not feel the defense proved this, added Daniel McCarthy. Some of the jurors felt that what they kept calling a switch in pleas hurt the case for the defense. They speculated it might have been better to have gone with an insanity plea from the very beginning. Then the confession wouldn't have mattered so much, stated one juror. Actually, I didn't know how I was going to vote until the entire tactics were changed, and the plea was for insanity. Then it appeared that both the defense psychiatrist and lawyer were admitting that Harry killed all 4. Other jurors didn't agree that the defense might have been different. I thought the defense attorney did everything he could in the boy's behalf, said Mary Flexon. He had a hard case to work with that confession in black and white. When we went for insanity, I'm sure he knew. When he went for insanity, I'm sure he knew the jury was convinced the boy had committed the murders. and I'm sure as a father his heart went out to the boy he was defending. As the jurors agreed on the verdict and prepared to announce it in court, Vincent Squazzo said, "I must confess there were some wet palms." Later in an interview with Tony Morrow of the Camden Courier Post, he declared, "We tried to maintain our composure, but I talked to the jurors afterward, and we all had some anxiety feelings. The feelings were not feelings of doubt," Squazzo said, "but they were a realization that this was a critical set of circumstances. A man's life hung in the balance. Some of us called on divine resources for help." Another juror also talked about the need for guidance. "One Sunday during the trial, 8 or 9 of us had a Bible study," said Michael Ronca. "As we sat together, we prayed that the Lord would lead us and grant us wisdom to make the right decision in the responsibility we have." The fact that we made the right decision according to law doesn't dispel the feeling and sympathy I have for Harry as a person. I hope he is able to get some help, and that somehow, some way, he finds what Harry needs and wants. The best trip home was a time of both gladness and sadness for the jurors. Gladness that the trial was over and they were returning to their families, and sadness because of the verdict they had to give. For the first time, they could talk freely, and they talked of many things. Some said the Ronnie version had been too far-fetched to believe. Others said that at the start they'd considered it might be possible. Naturally, Harry's lack of emotion came up for discussion too. The fact that he was so calm and composed got to a lot of jurors, and many were stunned that he was so cool when the verdict was read. When we got back to the jury room, you heard things like, "Oh my God, I can't believe it," said Richard Kalowski. "But he had emotions he was hiding," Mary Flexen maintained. "Underneath the surface, a very hurt kid was crying." "I guess we weren't supposed to look at his emotions," pointed out Paul McGuire, the disabled bus driver who had 4 children. "But even though we were only supposed to go by the facts, you had to observe him to give him a fair shake. Often he acted as though he was in another world. Nothing seemed to bother him. I really think if he had sat there and looked a little more concerned, he might have helped his cause, though I don't know what he had to help him." All of the jury members who consented to interviews said that they had a clear conscience that they made the right decision on the material that was given them, but most admitted to feeling sorry that they had no alternative to the verdict the law said they must give. "It shook me to think that this young boy was in such trouble, and that his whole life would be affected by the verdict," said Mary Flexon. "But it was something that had to be done. As a jury, it was our duty." Dorothy Crum, who'd lost her 21-year-old son in a car accident, had the same reaction. "I think everyone felt sorry for him, and I disliked some of the inefficiencies of the police and the way they treated him," she admitted. "But that can't alter your feelings if he did it. You have to go by the facts. I went home and said to all of my friends, don't push your children too far. I think we all had the feeling that you can push children too far." At one point, while going home on the New Jersey Turnpike, we could look in the direction of Yardville and see the prison buildings, Daniel McCarthy said. Then one of the deputies commented, "That's probably where he'll be placed." You could feel a hush come over the bus. Everything quieted down. "When you're as close in age to Harry as I am, you put yourself in his shoes," said Cheryl Anyazak, in summing up the jury's feelings. Harry was old enough to make his own decisions, yet he was also aware of the teaching that you should respect your parents' decisions. They're older. They're supposed to know better. Maybe if they'd been more understanding of Harry's feelings, this tragedy wouldn't have happened. I hope he can get the help he needs while he's young enough to still have a life. As a final comment on how people felt after the verdict was in, a college student who had known Harry since they'd been confirmed in their church wrote the following to the record. "I have a confession to make. I think we all have to make a confession. Those who know Harry de la Roche Jr. cannot blame him completely for his actions. How many of us perceived his loneliness, yet continued to add to it? How many of us contributed to the mockeries? How many of us can honestly say that we have never harmed him? We forget what the word human being means when it comes to others. Can you think of any Harrys that you know? No. No, I can't, buddy. That's the end of chapter 13, and we shall pick up with Roesch State Prison next time. What do we got? 11 pages, 12 pages left. And then we can move on to 6 lessons in crystal gazing, a complete course of instruction for the beginner by Dr. Rahman. But we still got some more Harry to deal with. Anyone's son. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.